Something unusual is unfolding in Washington, and it isn't being driven by Democrats or cable news panels. The tremor is coming from inside the Republican Party itself. For the first time in a long while, GOP lawmakers are not just whispering concerns about Donald Trump, they're acting on them. Quietly, methodically, and in some cases reluctantly. They are moving to curb the authority he appears determined to stretch to its outer edge. This is not the familiar rhythm of partisan gridlock. It's not another social media flare-up or a routine election year skirmish. It's something more structural. A confrontation over whether presidential power in the United States is ultimately constrained by law driven by the will of one individual. And what happens next could shape the rules of executive authority long after the headlines disappear. Picture the scene, late night in the Capitol complex. Staffers exchanging urgent messages, senators double-checking reports before forwarding them, because the frustration radiating from the White House isn't directed at Democrats this time. It's aimed squarely at members of the president's own party. And when internal resistance begins inside the governing coalition, rather than outside it, the stakes change dramatically. What's emerging is not typical ideological infighting. It's a more deliberate recalibration. Republican senators who once defaulted to loyalty are now weighing institutional limits against party allegiance. The tension centers on a fundamental issue. How far can a president go when invoking emergency powers, military authority, or unilateral executive action? The flashpoint came when concerns were raised publicly about rhetoric, suggesting the possibility of military leverage involving Greenland territory belonging to Denmark, a NATO ally. When Senator Chris Murphy addressed the implications bluntly, the reaction rippled outward, because strip away the theatrics, and you re-left with a stark legal reality. Denmark is protected under NATO's collective defense principle. The idea of force, even floated rhetorically, collides with treaty obligations and alliance commitments that define post-World War II U.S. foreign policy. That's not a trivial detail. It's a constitutional and strategic fault line. Inside Republican ranks, alarm bells began to sound not because of partisan calculation, but because once military authority is framed as a personal option, Congress must either assert its constitutional role or effectively surrender it. The mechanism for that assertion is the War Powers Act. Suddenly, a statute that often lives in legal textbooks became a live instrument of political friction. When Republican senators joined Democrats in advancing a resolution intended to limit unilateral executive military action, it marked a departure from reflexive party discipline. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't theatrical, it was procedural. And procedural moves can be the most consequential of all. The response from the president reportedly included anger and pressure directed at lawmakers such as Susan Collins, but the significance of that moment extended beyond one vote. It reflected something deeper, the realization that loyalty within a party has boundaries when constitutional authority is at stake. At the same time, the White House moved toward declaring a national emergency linked to Venezuelan oil interests. On the surface, it was framed as a national security imperative. Yet beneath that framing lay complicated timelines, infrastructure questions, and corporate energy dynamics that don't neatly translate into immediate benefits for ordinary Americans. Emergency declarations serve a dual purpose. They unlock executive tools and they reshape political narratives. They concentrate authority. They accelerate timelines. They shift public focus. And in moments of internal dissent, they can also function as instruments of consolidation. But complexity does not vanish because rhetoric intensifies. Nor do oversight responsibilities disappear because the language of crisis grows louder. That's where lawmakers like Sheldon Whitehouse entered the conversation, pressing questions about delayed disclosures, Inspector General compliance, and statutory deadlines. The issue was not accusation, it was process. Why had promised transparency initiatives slowed? Why were document releases stretching beyond projected timelines? Why did oversight require bipartisan pressure rather than executive momentum? Process questions may sound dry, they are anything but. They determine whether institutions remain functional. For a presidency built on velocity and narrative dominance, procedural scrutiny presents a unique challenge. It unfolds slowly. It accumulates. It generates paper trails rather than headlines. And paper trails are stubborn things. They don't dissipate in the next news cycle. This convergence war powers, disputes, emergency declarations, internal Republican resistance, And oversight inquiries is not a collection of isolated controversies. It is a systems test. It asks whether the constitutional architecture of American governance still asserts itself when the pressure originates from the executive branch rather than from external opposition. Inside the GOP, the calculation has shifted. Lawmakers facing re-election are not only considering party unity, they're weighing historical precedent, because today's expansion of executive authority becomes tomorrow's inherited standard. Once normalized, it doesn't belong to one president. It becomes available to the next, and that recognition changes behavior. Votes that might once have been automatic are now scrutinized. Private conversations are more candid. The tone is less about ideological alignment and more about institutional survival. This is not rebellion for spectacle, it is recalibration for preservation. The president, meanwhile, has responded by intensifying rhetoric, framing constraints as obstruction, oversight as hostility, and dissent as betrayal. But that approach carries its own risk. Power sustained primarily through intimidation rather than coalition building can erode the very alliances it depends upon. There is also the matter of legacy. A leader determined to be remembered as transformative may find that transformation collides with constitutional restraint. And when rhetoric about strength meets the practical limits of law and treaty, friction is inevitable. Public fatigue complicates everything. In an environment saturated with controversy, it becomes difficult to distinguish structural conflict from routine noise. Yet this moment feels heavier because the resistance is not purely partisan. It is institutional. It is procedural. It is emerging from within the governing party itself. The broader question is no longer whether a particular policy prevails. It is whether the framework of checks and balances remains active under strain. Can Congress reassert authority when it senses overreach? Can oversight mechanisms operate without being reframed as political vendettas? Can emergency powers remain exceptional rather than habitual? These are not abstract debates. They define how power functions in practice. History rarely pivots on a single speech or vote. It turns on cumulative decisions, small acts of assertion that either reinforce boundaries or allow them to blur. Republican lawmakers now face that inflection point. Is drawing a line an act of disloyalty or an act of stewardship? The answer will resonate beyond one administration, because democratic systems do not collapse overnight. They stretch, they normalize, they adjust, until eventually someone decides whether the line still exists. At this moment, that decision is being made inside the party that once provided near unanimous support. The world is watching, not for drama, but for durability. Whether institutional limits withstand rhetorical escalation, whether oversight proceeds despite narrative pressure, whether precedent is shaped by caution or by impulse. In the end, this story is less about personalities and more about structure. About whether constitutional boundaries are stronger than the ambitions of those who temporarily occupy high office, and about whether those inside the system will defend it, when doing so is politically uncomfortable. The unfolding conflict may not produce fireworks. It may unfold through amendments, committee hearings, and procedural votes. But those mechanisms are the quiet machinery of governance. And when they activate, they signal that the guardrails, though tested, are still present. What happens next will not only influence one presidency, it will define the template every future president inherits. And that is why this moment carries weight far beyond the current news cycle. Power meets its limits in subtle ways. Through oversight memos, through bipartisan resolutions, through senators deciding that constitutional duty outweighs short-term alignment, those choices, not declarations of emergency, ultimately determine whether institutions endure. The question is not who wins the next argument, it is whether the rules outlast the individuals. And that answer is being written now quietly, deliberately, and from within.